Yeah, I just want to welcome everybody for coming. And I see a lot of the names, lots of people who are using these course evals. So I think this is going to be a very keen discussion. And if you like today's topic, not only do we have a teaser for some upcoming stuff going on that we'll say at the end of this meeting, but if any of you are doing work that you want to share in a future CAN session, we meet the first Friday of every month at this time. We'll stay on Zoom for the next couple months, but then are experimenting with getting back in person. And so we look forward. So throughout the presentation, feel free to type in questions as they come in on chat. I'll be monitoring. And otherwise, if you can please join me in welcoming Becca by putting a clap in the chat or a clap reaction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janara and Francesca, for that introduction. Yeah, so I'm Becca. I'm the course evaluation service lead in research, teaching, and learning here at Berkeley. And yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about course evaluations and instructor customization of course evaluations. So just hop right into it. Yeah, so just an overview of course evaluations here at Berkeley, and specifically the course evaluations that we support in research, teaching, and learning. So we support around 80 campus units who are using online course evaluations, and this comes out to be course evaluations that are distributed to around 87% of student enrollments. Yeah, and the service first got started in around 2012. That's kind of when the pilot rolled out. And we've kind of grown steadily since then. And we currently partner with Berkeley Extension, Haas, and College of Engineering. So RTL, we support some units ourselves, but then, or the majority of units we support ourselves, but then College of Engineering, Haas, and Extension, they kind of have their own, they administer their own evaluations using the same system as we do. Yeah, so we currently support early, midterm, and end of term evaluations. So early evaluations just mean evaluations for any course that kind of ends earlier than the regular semester kind of end timeline, which is, I think 16 weeks. And then midterm evaluations are just evaluations that run in the middle of the term in addition to end of term evaluations, and then end of term evaluations, obviously, which happen at the end of the term before finals week. So a little bit about how the system is all set up. So we kind of have a centralized administration, which means that policy is centralized and it's applied campus-wide. There's a couple campus-wide questions that are asked on every course evaluation. And then there's also the opt-in campus service, which is my service that RTL supports. And we have our website, which is kind of the main hub for students filling out evaluations or instructors viewing or downloading their reports or viewing their response rates, and department staff as well who need access to reports. But then the actual application of course evaluations is decentralized. So departments have their own specific evaluation forms, which they decide on the content of those forms themselves. They're pretty different between departments. I have a very long file of all of the questions that every department asks, and it's very large. And then just in terms of data use, every department uses their data differently, as well as instructors, and how they apply that evaluation data that they get back. So just a little bit of history about the service. So it was first piloted in 2012 with a few different goals, mainly to streamline the evaluation process, automate distribution and analysis, provide timely access to results, improve data quality and integrity, and increase efficiency and reduce staff workload. So there was a 2009 report from the Berkeley Task Force on Teaching Evaluation that found that over 5,000 hours were spent each semester processing and compiling all this evaluation data, which if you've ever used paper evaluations, I'm sure you're very aware of how kind of time consuming and how much staff time that just takes up. So the service really had the goal to like reduce those thousands and thousands of hours that people were spending on compiling all of the data. So what does our service look like now? So in spring 2021, now I have to preface these metrics since College of Engineering, Haas, and Extension administer their own evaluations. Their numbers are not included. These are just numbers for the evaluations that RTL directly supports. So in spring 2020, we sent out over 173,000 individual evaluations to students. We were evaluating like over 5,400 individual sections. So these could be lecture sections, lab discussions, etc. And then this was around almost 3,300 individual instructors who were evaluated, both faculty and GSIs. And then what this came out to was around 6,400 individual reports that were distributed to instructors and department staff. Yeah, and so question personalization. So I kind of use the phrases instructor customization and question personalization interchangeably. So question personalization is kind of the term that the system, our system uses. But this just means that instructors are adding custom questions to their evaluations. So I'll be using this term a lot in case anyone is confused. Yeah, so before evaluations open to students, instructors are invited to add custom questions to their evaluations. They can currently add up to 12 questions, 6 rating questions, and 6 comment questions. And these questions and their responses are totally confidential. They're not shared with any other instructors. They're not shared with any department staff, like both the questions and the responses. If you're a GSI, they're not shared with the instructor for the course. They're only shared with the instructor who adds the questions. So it's changed a little bit over the years. Instructors were originally able to add up to 20 questions when we were first piloting the service, but then this was later reduced to 8 questions. And then in spring 2020, we increased the amount to 12 questions in anticipation that more instructors would want to add questions or ask about more things. Yeah, but on average, instructors only add around 3 to 4 questions to their evaluations. This has been the same pretty much for the past few years. This average hasn't. It's gone up a little bit to start around more like 3 questions, 3 to 4 questions, and now it's a little bit higher to like 4 to 5 questions, but it hasn't changed that much. So in spring 2020, over 2,000 unique custom questions were added by instructors to evaluations. And these questions were split pretty evenly between qualitative and quantitative, but there is a slight preference towards quantitative questions. So what this looks like for the numbers, this is the past few years. So you can see that qualitative questions, it's around 50 to 55% of questions. And then quantitative questions, it's around 45%, although there was a slight uptick in spring 2020 where there were more qualitative questions added than kind of the past few years. And so how many instructors actually use this feature of online course evaluations? Well, during the spring and fall semesters, I didn't take into account the summer semesters because these semesters are kind of a lot less courses are evaluated, and fall and spring are just more comparable. So on average, 7.9% of instructor evaluations include custom questions. So what this looks like over the years, yeah, this is the percentage over the years of how many instructors are adding custom questions. So you can see there is a definite increase, but we never really get to more than like, spring 2020, was the most we ever had of 16.7%. So even just looking at the last few years, that average really has only increased to around like 10 or 11%. So yeah, that's how many instructors use this feature. And then, so I didn't really want to get too much into the questions themselves and like individual questions, what instructors are asking, because since they are confidential, I didn't really want to share anything that might be that someone didn't want me to share. And it is kind of a core tenet of our service that data is confidential. But I have made some sort of generalizations. So in general, instructors want to know what is and isn't helpful. That was kind of a recurring theme across the questions. And so in spring 2020, as I mentioned before, it set the record for the highest ever use of question personalization. So yeah, 16.67% of instructors submitted custom questions, which was a 66% increase compared to fall 2019. And it actually doubled the amount of unique questions. So around 1,200 unique questions were added in fall 2019, and then around 2,400 unique questions were added in spring 2020. So 12 new departments were added to the service starting in spring 2020, who had previously been using paper evaluations and kind of needed to very quickly pivot. So we did add, I think that was the highest ever increase from like one semester to the next that we'd ever added. But it was still, the increase in question personalization was still pretty striking, even considering the amount of new departments that were using the service. Yeah, so in spring 2020, I think it's probably pretty obvious, but a lot of instructors were now asking about remote learning. Actually, the second most frequent word used was online, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then, yeah, some other common keywords were remote, Zoom, transition, and experience. So lots of interest in, yeah, students' experience with remote learning, using Zoom for the first time, and just their experience with COVID-19. Yeah, and so with this increase in question personalization use in spring 2020, it kind of made even more obvious this ambiguity with the user interface that resulted in a pretty significant error rate per semester of instructors who tried to submit custom questions, but the questions never actually got added to their evaluations. So what the interface looks like when an instructor adds questions, it's just like one page with instructions at the top for how to add questions, a little bit of information, and then there's a section for where you input your questions, and then at the bottom there's these two buttons, a save button and a submit button. And save and submit are pretty similar in terms of like, it's not really immediately obvious about what the difference is between the save and submit buttons to a lot of people. So the way the user interface works is that you actually need to click the submit button and only the submit button in order for your questions to be added to the evaluation. If you only click the save button, your questions will be saved in the user interface and you can come back to them later to edit them, but they will not be added to your evaluation. So we found that a lot of people were clicking the save button and not the submit button. And yeah, the error rate was around 7.7% per semester. And so what this looks like in the number of errors compared to the number of actual tasks where questions were successfully submitted, you can see in spring 2020, like this error rate went way up. There were a lot of errors, and this isn't really what we want to be seeing because there's not really any way for us to know when this is happening. And so what would happen is that instructors would think they had added their questions, get the report back after the term was over and evaluations were over, and there would be no responses and nothing for those questions that they thought they were asking. And so then they would contact us and say, well, what happened? Like, I tried to add these questions and there's nothing there. And it's like, well, the questions were never actually added and there's nothing we can do at this point. So yeah, this was really not what I wanted to be seeing. The error rate in summer 2020 was actually like the highest it had ever been. I think this was around like 12.6%. Yeah, so I wanted to solve this problem basically. So in fall 2020, I tried to update the instructions to make it extremely clear that you needed to click the submit button in order to have your questions added. I added bold and red text on the page. I added like a separate set of instructions at the bottom, like right below the buttons, just to try and increase the visibility of that. And it did have a bit of an effect. The error rate was reduced to around 4.9% in fall 2020, which was down from 12.5% in summer 2020, which if you look at the graph, it is a big difference. If you consider the difference only when comparing it to the previous 2 semesters. But if you look at the semesters kind of from 2019 to 2017, it's actually pretty much in line with those semesters. So not that much actually changed when you consider like the pre-COVID semesters. So then in spring 2020, I actually tried to change the user interface itself. And so credit for this idea goes actually to another user at another university who uses the same system. And they posted about this on our vendor community forum. And so I actually, changed the button text. So it no longer just said save and submit, it said save as draft and submit. And this had the desired effect. It reduced the error rate to 1.6%. And what this looks like on the graph is just a very, very small amount of errors, which was exactly what I wanted to see. Yeah. And then so in spring 2020, there were no support tickets about missing custom questions, which yeah, just made me happy, and I'm sure made instructors happy as well. Yeah. So now moving on to question personalization and response rate. Just gonna take a drink. Oh, I guess if we want to pause here, if there's any like questions about that previous topic before we move on, I can answer any questions too.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got a few that have come in, and a couple of them have to do with coordinating with instructors and stuff like that. So I'll just go in order. And if anyone who's typed in this question would like to unmute for further, discussion, please feel free to. So the first question says, we're on the cusp of deciding whether or not to stick with online teaching evaluations or go back to paper. Paper has a higher return rate, but our analysis shows return rate online depends hugely on instructor buy-in. It can range from 80% returns consistently to 30%. So Becca, is there any particular advice you have? I'm assuming this is not a unique thing to the English department. Anything you want to talk about here?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, it's kind of exactly what I'm going to talk about in the next section.
Oh, great. Darren, is it okay if we table this question till later then?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think a lot of us are really curious about that. So another question that came in is, does a higher question personalization limit add a heavier load on the system or staff processing time? And what kinds of things have motivated lowering this cap in the past?
No, I don't think it really, yeah, it doesn't. Increasing the amount of questions doesn't really, increasing or decreasing either way doesn't really affect the amount of process. I'm sure it affects it a little bit, but not significantly. Yeah, so I guess I think just kind of the reason we would reduce it was just to sort of increase or decrease unnecessary like things that we have in our system that we kind of have to maintain.
Great, thank you. And then do you know if question personalization correlates to higher student response rates? Are instructors more engaged to encourage students to respond to evals generally if they have at least one personalization in there?
Yeah, so that's kind of another question that I'm going to address in the next section. So yeah,
Okay.
if there's any questions about response rate, I think we can table those until the end, because that's what I'll be talking about.
Great. My final question was, and I loved your fix, like the story of how those buttons changed over time and like response rates. That was amazing. I've been thinking a lot about user interface, students accessing these same links from their phone or a small tablet versus desktop, laptop. So I didn't know if there was anything about like that, like the way they click on the link, which is a slightly different thing from when we send out the links. That's part of this story at all.
Yeah, so I don't actually have any data about where instructors or students are filling out evaluations. So whether it's mobile or desktop, the interface for filling it out will work on both. But yeah, I'm not sure if those two different, if there's any difference between the response rates or the experience for students filling out on those two different screens, I guess.
But your office is thinking about that in terms of layout stuff too, right?
Yeah, so I mean, so this is a vendor product. It's not something we like have built at Berkeley. But our vendors definitely, they know that students are using tablets and phones and stuff. So it's definitely something it's a feature that they have.
Great. Thanks. And
they're
the final
aware.
thing that came in chat, and this is from Carol in UC Berkeley Extension. So Carol, you can also unmute if I bungle this. She writes, you mentioned that only the instructors would see the results, and wondering how that's accomplished, because in Extension, we mail out PDFs to the departments and instructors and download them, and wonder if they would be included or not.
Yeah, so we actually just make two different sets of the reports. So one is for the department staff, and then one is for the instructor. And so those reports are generated. They're essentially the same, but only the instructor report contains those questions.
Okay, thank you. This is interesting. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Great, thanks. So I think those are all the questions in chat. So thanks for pausing for questions, and you can continue on with the next.
Yeah, okay, so just kind of diving right into it. So I put together this graph, which has both the kind of overall response rate and then the percentage of question personalization that was submitted each semester. I didn't really want to imply with this graph that, with the increase in question personalization, there's kind of a decrease in response rates. It might kind of look that way if you look at like spring 2020, there was like a big dip in response rates, but a big increase in question personalization. But I just wanted with this to sort of get kind of an overview of the past, really since like the beginning of online course evaluations, the use of both question personalization and then kind of how that is, what response rates look like as well when compared to that. And so, yeah, with response rates, see with the next slide where I kind of go into the departmental response rates, it's just a big mess. So yeah, this graph is it's just terrible. There's so much variance with departmental response rates. Like with individual departments, there's kind of a big difference between like overall response rates. You get some departments that have kind of an average of around 70 to 80% every semester, but some are much, much lower, around like 30 to 40%. And so what we can see from this graph is that even departments that have, I think one of the questions already mentioned this, is that even departments that have kind of a higher average or median response rate, there can still be so much variance, and there's tons of outliers. Some courses are getting 100%, some are getting 0% response rates. So it's really hard to draw any conclusions from this other than just like, wow, there's such a wide variety of response rates that any individual course or department can get. So when you kind of try and make a connection to response rates and question personalization, it's pretty difficult. One of the things that I found was that there is a slightly higher average response rate for evaluations that use question personalization versus evaluations that don't have any custom questions. So 52.7% versus 45.6%. This is from spring 2021. But if you try and look at individual courses, there's really not too much we can learn from this data. And the conclusion I kind of came to, which think everyone, it's not going to be a shock to anyone, is that response rates are very complicated. And there's so many different variables that can go into what increases or decreases a response rate. And question personalization is definitely, can be one of those factors, but there's so many other things that we just don't know what instructors are doing in kind of their day-to-day course, like how they're communicating about evaluations to students. So question personalization, I feel, is really it's just one tool for instructors, but instructors really need to be involved in the process of evaluation in other ways if they want to get kind of that feedback that they're looking for, that custom questions can kind of elicit. Yeah, so kind of coming back to the question of like, what are the pros and cons of doing paper evaluations that do have that kind of built-in, like very high response rate versus online evaluations where it can be much more difficult to get response rates as high as they kind of always are with paper evaluations. And yeah, I think it really is just kind of an individual department decision, really, because there are a lot of pros in terms of, this added benefit of question personalization, which isn't available with paper evaluations because they're all the same. The reduced kind of staff time involved in analyzing and compiling the data for evaluations. But then with paper evaluations, well, I guess with online evaluations, yeah, you do need to have instructor buy-in and instructor involvement in the process. So I think if you can kind of motivate instructors to be involved in the process of evaluation, then I think online evaluations are definitely better than paper evaluations because then you don't sort of have that issue of response rates. But if you just want high response rates, then, and you don't really want, and yeah, you can't motivate instructors to kind of be involved in the process, then it may be better to move back to paper. Yeah, so that's my presentation. I think there was another question about response rates. Let me know if I answered it or didn't answer it. Yeah, just let me know if there's any more questions too.
I have a question. So do you think that the formatting of paper evaluations just automatically, promotes higher rates of responses where, like there is no instructor buy-in, that like an instructor does not have to exert any effort. I mean, besides distributing paper evaluations, like the instructor doesn't have to, go after students and, ask them to fill them out. So in that sense, like I'm just thinking there is, there is a certain labor that we're expecting of instructors, to do with online. So with paper, the expectation is that there isn't that labor there. Like the materiality of paper just makes it for, makes up for that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, pretty much. I think that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that with paper evaluations, students are in a classroom. They're kind of, yeah, with paper, it's just kind of like another thing that they're having to do, like maybe a quiz or a homework or whatnot. So you know, it's like familiar to them and they're all there, and it's just like, well, I'm just gonna do this and then turn it in and never think about it again. Whereas with online, it's kind of like you're getting emails, which people really just don't read emails, or they're very easy to ignore them and then forget. So yeah, it really does require kind of that extra effort by instructors to motivate.
Some thoughts about paper, just that I wonder if you know, at Extension we used to have paper evaluations, and it's a challenge because I think that when you administer paper, you also are having to try to ensure confidentiality, and sometimes I wonder if the confidentiality part of it is enforced. Like sometimes the instructor would just collect them and read them before they give them back to the department, and then sometimes you would get, I think that you would get a very large response rate for a particular class if they're turned in, but sometimes you never get them back for some classes. And that's one of the challenges too that we've had at Extension with paper evaluations and some of the concerns that I have.
Yeah, that's definitely a really good point. And yeah, like one of the things I mentioned about at the beginning about one of the goals that this online evaluation service had was to improve data integrity and quality. So like with paper evaluations, yeah, like it's much harder to kind of ensure that confidentiality. So many people are going to have those evaluations, are going to go to so many different hands, and kind of so many different people are going to kind of see them and interact with them before they even you know, are kind of compiled and distributed in as anonymous data. So yeah, there's definitely that to consider as well, that yeah, with an online system, just student data is much more secure. There's a much better chance of maintaining that student anonymity and confidentiality.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of more comments and questions that came into the chat. One is for you. You mentioned that you're using this tool that's not a Berkeley built one. So is it Qualtrics? What is the actual tool administering the evals?
Yeah, so the name of it is Blue. And so we work with our vendor, Explorance, who, yeah, it's their kind of evaluation platform. They have, yeah, they work with a lot of other universities, as well as businesses. They also have a kind of business side and higher education side to their evaluation system.
Great. And then there's an open question to everyone participating in this. So for you, Becca, certainly, but for anybody else, what have people done to raise instructor engagement with online evaluations? And somebody else said, yeah, I'd like to learn this too. There needs to be department buy-in. The instructor, if the instructor knows the department's looking at evals and it's important to the department, they may be more engaged. But is that the main factor? So if anyone, and I do know, I think both Rebecca Ruse and Carol Cerny are here from Extension, so I know they take the lead on administering this. So I would love to hear from one of them. But anybody else who's got ideas of raising instructor engagement after Becca speaks is welcome to unmute. Becca, do you have any specific?
Yeah, I have lots of ideas for how instructors can improve their response rates. I think we've found, or a lot of instructors have found, that incentivizing evaluations is a very good way, like giving extra credit for evaluations. You know, it does kind of require even more work on the instructor's part, because they have to kind of collect those confirmations from from students, because we don't share that information about which students have completed evaluations. But then also just, and this is something that I've heard from other universities. I was actually just in a conference earlier this week about, well, it was a conference held or hosted by our vendor for our course evaluations platform. Yeah, so a lot of people were talking about response rates. And one university, it was interesting, they surveyed students actually to ask them, like, well, what do you actually, like, what motivates you to fill out evaluations? And I think a lot of students said setting aside class time was really helpful. So I think maybe in the online remote learning world, that's kind of more difficult to do, because kind of, students are just on Zoom, and it's a lot easier to just be like, well, okay, we're taking this break where I'm supposed to fill out an evaluation, but I'm just gonna look at my phone or whatnot. But when students are in the classroom, I think that it's much more beneficial to kind of set aside that class time for evaluations, as well as just personal reminders from instructors. So instead of just our, automated kind of standardized reminders that go out every so often, if a student or if an instructor kind of sends a personal message, personal reminder to students, that can also be very helpful. And there are a lot of other ways. We have some listed on the Center for Teaching and Learning's website. So yeah, there are a lot of ways that instructors can improve that rate.
I wonder sometimes if, I often see on TeachNet about instructors, and there's been studies out there about evaluations and how they don't really measure effectiveness of teaching, and that they could be biased. So I wonder if there's a lot of lack of buy-in from faculty on student course evaluations in general, and that might impact whether they might encourage a higher response rate or not. And I also remember that prior to COVID, there was some efforts to try to create to update campus questions for evaluations to reduce that type of bias. I don't know if there's been any movement on that since COVID, but does anybody know?
Yeah, I think I can answer that actually. So I think there has been movement on that. I know that the Committee on Teaching submitted a few like recommendations for changes to course evaluation policy. And so one of those changes that I believe will be moving forward is changes to those mandatory campus-wide questions. So they're no longer going to ask about just instructor or course effectiveness. There's going to be some different questions that are more specific. Yeah.
Thanks. And Becca, do you mind if we stop your screen share just so that, like, the few of us who are here now can all see each other? And thanks. And you also mentioned before that there's on your website, you've got some ideas. I wonder if you'd be able to put a link in the chat to where on the CTL website has some of these ideas, would be great. I know, I think one of the parts of this story, besides using in class, like Darren mentioned, credit, for those instructors and lecturers and faculty who used B course, like before the pandemic even, if you use B courses a lot for assignments anyway, I used to make an assignment, a 0-point assignment, but like a done or not done by the date, like just tell me when you submitted. And that upped my rates. There were, but I have to admit, I once took time in class, invited them all to take out their phones, right? And supposedly for the next 5 minutes, they were filling out their evals. It still was not 100%. So, but I think anything we can do to reach out and actually, I think the biggest factor I know as an instructor was ensuring the students that I'm going to be taking this feedback seriously as an instructor. And that was a good counterpart to like the official kind of like, dear student, fill out a course eval, and then they get a bunch of those. So I just want to advocate for also making better use of B courses, like 0-unit assignments or other kinds of access to the link as a secondary link for the email they'll get.
I work on evaluations for the School of Information, and one of the things that I'm seeing is that yes, instructor buy-in is very important, but this is extra time. I mean, the instructors, it's extra labor for instructors to be doing this, and not a lot of instructors have the bandwidth for this sometimes, and so what ends up happening is that it's the staff who have to do a lot of this type of like sending reminders, hammering instructors emails with reminders, sending emails to individual classes, and I just wanted to see what is it like in other universities, from your experiences, because I keep hearing, and also I have personal experience that there is a grade release. The grade release is timed. Is dependent on the course evaluation fill out. So if you fill out the evaluations, you get your grades like a day faster. You see your final grade a day faster. So I know this is not a practice at Berkeley, but I'm just curious, what do other universities do in this regard? I know there's a lot of debate about this, but
yeah, I think a lot of universities do utilize that type of blocking, whether it's like grade blocking or also like course content blocking. And it can be very, very effective in getting your response rates up, but it's also very disruptive to the students. So one thing I know I heard a couple of different universities talking about this at the conference I attended was that, they tried kind of both ways with grade blocking, but then so many students complained about it that they got rid of it. But then the response rate dropped so much that they decided to reinstate it and just kind of deal with that students complaining. So it's just kind of a trade-off about how much you want to disrupt your students.
Great, thanks. And thank you so much for the link to the how can instructors encourage students to complete course evaluations and provide informative responses. We'll include that link when we send out this has been recorded, and we're going to send this out as part of our CAN email, like follow up to this. So we'll include that link. There's a question that's in some departments, students' evals are one of the criteria used for determining continuing employment and or tenure. And I wonder, I mean, I can confirm that from our program, but I wonder, Becca, if you can kind of confirm like how much you know of that, or how much that was a factor in the kinds of questions that are there or not in the official course evals.
Yeah, I mean, definitely departments use course evaluations for kind of faculty reviews. I don't have that much insight into kind of that process. I think kind of every department is different, and they kind of do something different. So I know that it does happen, but as for the specifics about how those evaluations are used, or what is happening, I'm not sure.
And do you have any updates on like what the academic senate's, because there's a committee on the academic senate that like at least gives, you know, suggestions for questions or asks for changes, right? So is that like an annual process? It is that whenever they decide they want to change the questions process? How does that factor in?
Yeah, I think it's just whenever they decide, basically.
But like if you got an email from the academic senate, dear Becca, just change question 3, like that's it, you change question 3, or is like they one of the partners in there because you know, in addition to the customized questions, the set ones still require some organization.
Yeah, well, I don't think we've ever actually gotten an email like that. But yeah, I think I mean the questions have never, or the required questions have never actually been changed before. So in terms of that process, I think it's still kind of ongoing, and what that process actually looks like. I don't think it's not just an email from someone, but yeah, it's a good question. And I think like the Committee on Teaching and kind of the policymakers for course evaluations kind of decide about how that happens and how changes are kind of enacted.
And there's a question in the chat. You mentioned that campus has 2 required questions. What are they? Do you happen to know?
Yes. Let's see. I see them so much, and can I actually remember? Well, so they're about effectiveness. It's like considering both the limitations and something of this course. How would you rate like the effectiveness of this instructor, or and there's 2: effectiveness of the instructor and effectiveness of the course. The wording is, it's not the exact wording, but that's the general gist of it.
Okay, yeah, because there's an effectiveness of the course, and that has a 1 through 6 or whatever, and then there's a second question, like how likely are you to recommend this course? Is this separate question on it right now in the generic ones that we use? But yeah, great. Well, thank you. Listen, I want to honor time. First of all, if everybody who's left can join me in thanking Becca for this wonderful presentation. We will be, and Alfred, I think you can stop the recording now.